Chapter 1. The Last Ordinary Day. At the exact moment the first rays of sun broke through the heavy clouds over Brooklyn, Henry Miller was saving a life. His elderly neighbor, Mrs. Donovan, screamed on the stairwell. Her cat was stuck between the railings. Henry, just heading out for his morning run, instantly sprang into action. He carefully freed the frightened animal, calmed the old lady, and returned home with her grateful thanks and a slice of homemade pie in a bag. For Henry, there was nothing unusual in this gesture. He was always trying to help people around him, volunteering at a charity foundation, working as a social worker, helping at neighborhood cleanups, solving other people's minor day-to-day problems. Around the block, he was known as the guy who never walks by. That morning, as usual, he had a quick breakfast and left for work. His office was a couple of blocks from his house, a small company dealing with child protection and vulnerable families. Henry was respected by colleagues and management alike. He was reliable, never made a fuss, rarely took sick days, and always closed projects on time. The team felt almost like family, especially compared to the constant complaints about salaries and endless reforms. At lunch, he stopped by a small coffee shop where the barista greeted him by name, scribbled "Hero of the Day" on his cup as a joke, and handed him a free cookie. Promo for people who helped neighbors that morning. The whole day went by in a normal rush. Meetings, calls, helping clients. The world seemed to revolve around simple things: reports, calls to parents, caring for loved ones. In the evening, he went to the gym, as usual stayed late, then dropped by his sister's house to return the summer house keys she'd been asking for. His sister greeted him with a smile. His nephews gave him big hugs. Then he spent a couple of hours helping a neighbor assemble furniture and popped by the store to pick up groceries for an elderly couple on the 4th floor. Late that night, he returned to his quiet, cozy apartment, took off his jacket, watched his favorite old movie, and went to bed feeling tired but at peace. The world was full of worries, but he was needed by the people around him. Waking up in the middle of the night, Henry heard a noise outside his door. Someone was trying the lock. His heart raced, but when he peeked through the peephole, no one was there. Taking a deep breath, he tried to fall back asleep, blaming it on exhaustion and anxious dreams. The next morning started off strange. His phone wouldn't take calls, and his bank card wouldn't work at the grocery store. He rushed to the office, but his access badge was inactive. At reception, no one could explain why his name was missing from the employee list. His work email was disabled. The login page said, "Account deleted due to death of owner." A coworker saw him outside, gave him a surprised look, and his boss called from a strange number saying all the paperwork was being processed. Henry tried to reach family, but their phones were silent, as if everyone around had suddenly forgotten he existed. On his way home, he saw his picture, not in a family album, but on a big screen outside the neighborhood theater, with the words, "In memory of Henry Miller, memorial service this Sunday." His blood ran cold. He tried to talk to people on the street, but they just shrugged, looking right through him. His mailbox was stuffed with funeral home ads. On his kitchen counter, there was an invitation to his own funeral. Name, birth date, date of death. All correct. By nightfall, things had completely spun out of control. His bank account was locked, his insurance canceled, all social media erased, neighbors avoided him. Even Dory, the dog from the 3rd floor, didn't come up to him on the stairs. Henry tried to figure out if he was the victim of a twisted prank or a system error. He called former colleagues, friends, even lawyers, but got nothing but empty lines or automatic responses. This number is no longer in service. He sat in the dark in his apartment, surrounded by documents, photos, and condolence letters, unable to believe his eyes. The familiar, orderly world had disappeared overnight, replaced by a wall of indifference and official language. Everything that was once familiar now felt like a dream. For the first time in his life, Henry felt truly alone, as if someone had just erased his existence with the push of a button. Chapter 2. The Disappearance. Henry barely slept that night. He woke up restless, still hoping that the bizarre events of the day before were just some kind of mistake. At sunrise, he headed to the nearest ATM, thinking maybe it was just a glitch. But the ATM didn't recognize his card. The screen flashed a message. Account closed due to account holder's death. He felt a chill crawl up his spine. Henry tried calling the bank, but every time he was either put on endless hold or met with an automated message, a digital voice politely expressing condolences and saying information could only be given to the deceased's next of kin. Confused and a bit desperate, he turned to his neighbors, but it was like he was invisible. On the stairs, people avoided his gaze, rushed past, or just ignored him altogether. Someone actually paused on the landing, gave Henry a nervous look, and hurried off as if afraid to catch his bad luck. At the post office, they wouldn't process his complaint, saying that according to their database, he was deceased. He tried to log into the city portal from an internet cafe. Access denied, account blocked, due to death. His mailbox was stuffed again, this time with more funeral service ads and memorial offers. Even the local newspaper he grabbed from a newsstand by the subway featured a short piece about a memorial gathering for him. He made his way to the office. Maybe they could clear things up there. But the security guard at the front desk refused him entry, saying he couldn't let in someone without ID, and that Henry was no longer on the employee roster. Frustrated, he called his boss, only to reach a deadline. A call to an old coworker also went unanswered. He even stopped by the police station, but that was even more surreal. After checking his ID, the desk sergeant handed it back with a look of pity and advised him to find peace, saying that contacting law enforcement after death didn't make sense. That's when Henry realized it wasn't just some bureaucratic mess or a bad prank. He was being erased from life itself. On the way home, someone called his name. It was a guy from the charity where Henry delivered meals to the elderly. The man came close, but when he saw Henry's face, he turned pale, mumbled something, and hurried away, not believing his own eyes. That kept happening. People he'd known for years acted like he was a ghost. Later that night, someone tied a black ribbon to his apartment door, and a funeral wreath with a "Rest in Peace" tag was left at his doorstep. That's when Henry felt real fear. For the first time, it was as if he'd been killed for the world, but left alive, inside his own life. Desperate for some connection to reality, he tried going to his sister's place. The door was slightly open, and inside he saw relatives gathered around a table, with his photo framed in black on the wall. His nephews, dressed in black, flipped through old cards, some of which Henry had sent for birthdays or holidays. In the hallway, people thumbed through an album, and every photo of Henry was either cut out or covered with a strip of black tape. When his sister spotted him, she recoiled and quietly closed the door, as if she'd seen a ghost. Even his attempt to leave a note was useless. It was thrown away, unread. Stumbling home in shock, Henry noticed flyers all over the neighborhood, announcing a memorial service for our dear neighbor, Henry Miller. The guest list included his relatives, coworkers, friends, even old classmates. With every new detail, it became clearer. Someone, or something, was systematically erasing him, and no one was stopping it. That night, he sat at his window in the dark, watching the occasional passerby and feeling reality slip through his fingers. Everything that had seemed solid, home, family, job, friendship, was now just emptiness and indifference. The final straw came the next morning. A letter in a neat envelope waited by his door. Inside was an invitation. The memorial service for Henry Miller will be held Sunday at 11 a.m. at St. Patrick's Church. All who cared about him are welcome to share this moment of sorrow. The sender's name: the Miller family. Henry realized he couldn't wait any longer. If there was any chance to set things right, he'd have to find out who was erasing him and try to reclaim the right to live, at least in his own eyes. Chapter 3. Erased from the world. Henry started the morning numb and disconnected, as if a thick, invisible wall had come between him and the rest of the world. Outside, life rolled on. The janitor swept the sidewalk. The mailman delivered the news. But Henry saw it all, as if through aquarium glass. Distant, distorted, unreachable. He moved in slow motion, dressing carefully in his best suit, the one reserved for special occasions, then lingered at the mirror. He searched his face for some hint of his old self, but saw only a tired man with empty eyes. a man who, in just a week, had lost everything that had ever given his life meaning. He left his apartment and, out of habit, greeted his neighbors, but there wasn't a single response. One man actually crossed to the other side of the hallway, as if he might catch a curse by getting too close. There was a fresh flyer on the building's bulletin board. Today, memorial service for Henry Miller. All are welcome who knew and loved him. Henry gripped the funeral invitation tighter, rereading the time and address, shrinking inside at the idea that today he'd come face to face with what he had become in everyone else's eyes. The weather outside was gray and damp, as if nature itself felt the weight of the day. On the way to the church, Henry saw people moving in small groups, many dressed in black, some holding flowers or wreaths. Passing by a shop window, he spotted his own obituary, a special ad for free tea for all attendees at the memorial. The city had adjusted to this new reality with chilling speed. Henry Miller's existence was over, and life marched on. At the church entrance, silence hung in the air, broken only by whispers. The main hall was decorated with wreaths. Henry's photo stood on an easel, and a slideshow played on a screen. Moments from his life with family, colleagues, and neighbors. But on some photos, his face was blurred, as if even the technology wanted to emphasize his absence. An old woman played a sad melody on the church piano. Almost everyone who'd ever mattered to Henry was there. His sister, his nephews, old friends, co-workers, neighbors, even people he hadn't seen for years. They sat stiffly in the pews, some wiping away tears, some whispering, all wrapped in a strange, tense mood. Henry took a seat in the very back, hoping to remain invisible. He watched his family and coworkers with a strange, out-of-body feeling, as if he'd stumbled into a play where everyone was following a script he hadn't read. The service began with a priest talking about the kindness and selflessness of the deceased, how Henry was a pillar for friends and family, a helper for those in need, an example for young people, a true friend. His sister followed, sharing childhood stories, how Henry supported her in hard times, took care of their parents, watched over her kids, and always found something good to say, no matter how dark things got. His nephews recited poems, neighbors told stories about the cat he once rescued from a tree, or how he'd saved someone from a spiral of debt. Henry listened, hardly able to believe they were speaking about him. It was like the person in those stories existed only in other people's memories, not in any kind of living reality. There was a strange bitterness. These memories were warm, but they could never substitute for real life. With each speech, Henry felt the gap between himself and the living grow. The people in the church remembered him as something far away and unreachable, as if he had become a legend instead of a man. After the service, people began to file out, some pausing at his photo, some hugging each other and sharing memories. Henry tried to approach his sister, but she walked right by him. His coworkers murmured about how much they'd miss him. Neighbors commented that the building would be quieter now. No one saw Henry. No one heard his voice. No one felt his presence. He stood off to the side, watching this strange parade of mourning, and for the first time, truly understood. He no longer existed to the world. Leaving the church, Henry wandered through the city, breathing the wet air and refusing to think about what came next. His apartment now felt foreign, the city empty, his life suspended and unfinished. All he had left was his own awareness, which no one else shared. The world had erased him from its memory, and now he was alone with the silence, left to figure out whether he could find a new reason to exist or simply vanish for good. Chapter 4. Invitation to Goodbye. Henry returned home from his own funeral ceremony, feeling completely detached from reality. Everything that had once seemed solid and meaningful had turned to fog, cold and unreachable. He stepped into his apartment, where family photos still hung on the walls, his old books sat neatly on the shelves, and the air still held the faint aroma of fresh coffee. But none of it felt like a refuge anymore. Instead, it was a quiet trap, a constant reminder of a life he no longer belonged to. Henry sat on the sofa, surrounded by paperwork and letters left over from the past week. He tried to find some clue, an explanation, a reason. But every document and every email only confirmed the same thing. He was gone. Not just from databases, but from the memories and hearts of his family, neighbors, and friends. As the week dragged on, everything seemed to get worse. He stopped trying to go back to work. The office now had a memorial board where colleagues pinned little notes about him, but not a single one could open the door back into reality. At the store, no one would ring up his groceries. At the clinic, he was asked to leave the line because it was for the living. Even the dog from the third floor, who had once wagged his tail every time he saw Henry, now passed by as if his old friend didn't exist. Henry realized the streets themselves had changed. Emptier, colder, as if the whole city was mourning with him. Sometimes he would watch from his window as relatives brought flowers to his grave. At the local cemetery, he saw an old friend pause by his photograph, gazing at it as if searching for something beyond the black and white portrait. One afternoon, Henry noticed people he didn't recognize wandering his building. Dressed in black, they took notes, checked paperwork, snapped photos of his front door. Later that evening, Henry found a letter in his mailbox. No return address. Inside was a formal white card embossed with an invitation. Henry Miller, you are requested to attend the farewell ceremony. Sunday, 11 a.m., St. Patrick's Church. Organizers. Your family. Beneath the card was a handwritten note, the handwriting clearly unfamiliar. If you want to know the truth, come. It was the first human gesture he had received in days. Henry turned the note over in his hands for hours, studying every letter, searching for a familiar signature. He wasn't sure if anyone truly expected him there, but a burning anger began to replace his numbness. Not toward the people around him, but at the whole system that had so easily stripped him of his voice, his right to protest, his right to simply exist. With his life seemingly destroyed, only one path was left: to show up at the place he'd been invited, and maybe finally learn what had happened to him. On Sunday morning, Henry put on his best suit again. He shaved slowly and carefully, as if preparing for the most important meeting of his life. The city was eerily quiet. Only the church bells echoed through the streets where houses and trees stood still, shrouded in dawn mist. On his way to the church, he saw people arriving with lowered eyes, some leading children by the hand, others carrying bouquets. No one recognized him. Everyone passed by without so much as a glance. Out front, he saw his family, his sister, his nephews, a few distant relatives. No one looked at him. No one noticed. Inside, slow music filled the church, and the morning light shone through tall windows, painting long rectangles on the floor. Henry found a dark corner and stood alone. The service unfolded in the same hushed, mournful tone as before. People recalled his best qualities, his kindness and generosity, the small acts of decency that once seemed trivial but now sounded like legend. But something felt different today. There were strangers in the back rows, men in dark suits holding folders, watching everyone closely. When the pews were filled, one of these men approached the altar, whispered something to the priest, and opened a folder. In an official, practiced voice, he read a declaration. Henry Miller is officially declared deceased. All property, finances, and social rights are terminated. Complaints will not be accepted. In case of new evidence, please contact the address below. He placed the paper on the altar, swept the crowd with a steady gaze, and returned to his seat. Henry felt the room shrink, growing stuffy and claustrophobic. He wanted to scream, to force everyone to turn, see him, remember him, acknowledge him, but he walked out of the church in silence and stood on the steps, staring out at a city that carried on as if he had never existed. He looked back at the church, at the people inside sharing stories about him, making lunch plans, getting on with life, as though he was only a memory. Henry understood that the farewell was not just a ceremony. It was a dividing line, a marker for a new life he'd have to start from nothing, empty and terrifying, without the comfort of anyone else's recognition. Chapter 5. Funeral for the Living. Henry barely felt the chill as he walked down the church steps into the misty Sunday morning. Everything that once felt real now seemed distant, faded, and spectral. He wandered through the city streets he had known since childhood, and in every window saw reflections of his new invisibility. Families gathered at breakfast discussing his passing, some even crying, others showing relief, a few talking with a heavy kind of longing. But to them, as Henry drifted by, he was nothing more than a passing shadow, a stray draft in a hallway, a half-remembered memory. At home, Henry switched on his old radio. Even there, he heard a short report about his own life, a journalist reciting his community work, the money he'd helped raise for a sick child, the homeless man he'd sheltered during a blizzard, the neighborhood cleanup he organized during a scorching summer. The announcer's voice was cool and detached, as if reading the biography of a stranger. Henry stood by the window, listening to stories of his own kindness as if they belonged to someone else. The day stretched endlessly. He tried to find purpose, to join the living, but the city was full of people who no longer saw him. He attempted to sit at his favorite coffee shop. The barista who'd joked with him for years now didn't notice him at all, serving others instead. His neighbors, once grateful for his help with leaky pipes or broken appliances, now discussed his absence while sitting on a courtyard bench, oblivious to his presence. Even the old dog, once thrilled to see Henry outside, ran past him with no recognition. At some point, Henry decided to visit his office. The badge that had once granted him access no longer worked. Through the glass, he saw colleagues gathered in the dim break room, flowers arranged on the table, a photograph of Henry on the wall, draped in a black ribbon. Someone was reading written memories aloud, funny stories from team meetings, accounts of how Henry always helped with the hardest tasks. His boss moved around the room handing out slips of paper for everyone to write what they appreciated most about Henry. Some people cried, others forced a laugh to hide their grief. Not a single person looked at the figure in the doorway. He was nothing but air. Leaving the office, Henry drifted through the city without direction, walking until he found himself at the edge of town, where a true farewell ceremony was being held. Relatives, friends, acquaintances, even strangers had gathered on an open lawn, dressed in black, carrying flowers, notes, and old photographs. Some offered toasts in Henry's honor, others told jokes or recited poems. His sister spoke about how Henry could always be counted on, how his loss could never be filled. His nephews left toys on a makeshift altar. People shared stories of the words of comfort Henry had given them when he himself was struggling. Henry hovered at the edge of the gathering, watching this parade of memories. It hurt, strange and sharp, to witness people dissecting his life as if he were a case study, all while he had no part in it. He studied the faces, sadness, discomfort, even a trace of relief. Some guests left early, unable to handle the weight of emotion, while others lingered, searching for more memories to share. He noticed strangers in dark suits, those who had made his death official, moving among the mourners, quietly noting names, snapping photographs, sharing brief, cryptic remarks. Henry realized his disappearance wasn't just a personal loss. It was now part of some larger machine where the fate of a person could be decided by a process with no appeal. When the ceremony ended, people slowly drifted away. Some left flowers, others placed photos, a few simply paused in silent farewell. His sister lingered at the altar before leaving a tiny note. "Farewell, Henry. You'll always be with us." Henry stood across from her, unable to reach out, unable to say a word, unable to let them know he was still here, still alive, still desperate for connection. As evening fell, Henry felt the last threads binding him to the world unravel. All obligations, all connections, all recognition had evaporated. Only silence remained. No one called his name. No one asked for his help. No one remembered the sound of his voice. For the first time, Henry realized he had not just been erased from records, he had been wiped from the memory of the living. Now he could only ask himself who he really was, if all those people and moments were gone, and yet he remained, alone among the shadows of his own past. Chapter 6. The year when freedom arrives. Henry greeted the morning in an apartment that no longer felt like home, or even a shelter. The city outside moved on, its rhythms muffled and distant, as if carried by wind from another world. Days stretched into weeks, weeks blurred into seasons, winter faded into spring and then summer, but drama had long left Henry's life behind. He existed now like a transparent figure in a faded photograph, no longer trying to prove to anyone he was alive, no longer seeking out company, no longer hoping for a miraculous reversal. He lived quietly, almost invisibly, as if he were exploring the very boundaries of solitude and detachment. In the beginning, Henry clung to the rituals of his old life. He went out in the morning for bread, though no one greeted him at the bakery, and no clerk handed him a warm loaf with a familiar smile. He once tried to see a doctor, but was denied. His name sat in the archives among the dead. He made attempts to enter his old library, only to have the security guard gently block the way, apologizing and closing the door. Henry learned to avoid crowded places where eyes slid past him as if he were nothing but a shadow. He made his purchases at small corner stores, where cash was all that mattered, where no one asked questions and no records were needed. For a time, Henry still chased a thin thread of hope. He wrote letters to newspapers, sent appeals to government offices, even reached out to lawyers. The answers always came back the same. Henry Miller has been officially declared deceased, all documents void, all rights and obligations ended. Even his emails bounced back undelivered. He browsed old websites where he'd once left reviews or comments, only to see a small line. Deceased user. Eventually, Henry realized these efforts were just delaying the inevitable. He would have to learn to survive in this strange new existence. He changed his walking routes, exploring parks at the city's edge, where no one knew his face. There, he found old men feeding birds, children on bikes, stray dogs sleeping in the grass. In these out-of-the-way places, no one asked who he was or why he wandered alone. Once, a young boy fell from the swings. Henry picked him up and brushed the dirt from his knees. The boy's mother smiled and thanked him, never recognizing Henry, never asking his name. For a brief, strange moment, Henry felt useful again, even if only as a stranger. Month by month, Henry discovered a new kind of freedom. At first, it frightened him. The idea of living without a past, without a name, without even the hope of being remembered, was terrifying. But slowly, a quiet release took root. No one expected calls, no one needed his help, no one asked for explanations. He read more books than ever before, watched sunrises and sunsets from quiet benches, wandered the riverfront, and felt the changing seasons as if he were seeing them for the first time. What once felt trivial, the warmth of spring wind, the tap of summer rain on glass, the crunch of snow underfoot in winter, became the center of his world. At some point, he began to keep a diary, not for others, but for himself. Every night, he wrote down not just the day's events, but thoughts he'd never dared to record. He pondered the nature of memory, the real measure of a life. What makes a person alive? If the world refuses to recognize them, he jotted down moments of kindness, rare disappointments, fleeting joys. The diary became his anchor, a record that he still existed even if no one else would ever know. A year passed. On the evening of the anniversary of his own funeral, Henry sat on a park bench beneath the first emerging stars. The city's distant hum reached him only as a faint vibration. An elderly woman, whom he'd once helped with her groceries, joined him on the bench. She shared her gratitude for a kind stranger who had once offered her a hand. Henry listened, smiled gently, never revealing who he was, and found, in that moment of anonymity, not emptiness, but peace. He understood finally that life had not vanished. It had simply changed shape. The past was only a memory, the future nothing but the promise of another morning. Henry rose, inhaled the cool air, and walked home, not looking back. There was nothing holding him anymore, not old attachments, not anyone else's expectations. Freedom had not come when he was remembered. It came when he stopped fearing anonymity and began to build a new life. Quietly, honestly, step by step, day by day. Alone, but wholly himself.